Always takes a few minutes for everybody to get situated and for the technology to get sorted out as well.
Okay.
Just a moment as we get more people in. All right. Looks like everything's in the right place now. Just give it a second for the last few people to join. I'll remind people right off at the top, next week, Thursday, is New Year's Eve. And as I know that many people will be having plans, we will not be having class next week. Just I'll mention that again at the end, but next Thursday, there is no Pathway to Judaism class. The Wednesday classes next week will continue as usual.
Okay.
Just one more minute. I don't have any meetings to run off to, so I don't have to be quite so strict on the time today, but we'll see. Make sure the YouTube system is working. Looks like it's good so far. All right, my clock says we win another minute, so let's go ahead and get this going. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our next installment of Pathway to Judaism. We are going to be discussing tonight Medinat Yisrael, which is the Hebrew for the State of Israel, and I just want to explain that title a little bit. Of course, Israel, the land, has been around for a very long time. Israel, the people, has been around for a very long time. But when we talk about Medinat Yisrael, or the State of Israel, we mean the modern state of Israel that was formally recognized and established in 1948. But as we're going to see, it had deeper roots than that. But it is still essentially what a historian would call a modern phenomenon, something that is a product of the modern world. Now, the reason why we're doing this right after last week's class, where we discussed the movements, is because last week we discussed the three different movements: Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, which in sequence were official responses by different groups of Jews who formed institutions to pursue goals that would allow them to deal with the upheavals of the modern world. Beginning in the Enlightenment, but then, of course, accelerating into the 1800s and 1900s. The State of Israel, that is to say, the modern State of Israel, 1948 and all of that, blue and white flag, is a fourth response to modernity. It's not a religious response in the classical sense, meaning that, as we'll see, the early Zionists, which is what we call people who were advocating for the establishment of the State of Israel in the 1800s and 1900s, and a term that's still used today, but with slightly different meaning, which we'll talk about when we get to part 2 of this discussion. The term Zionist refers to people who looked at the problems of Europe, and it is primarily a European phenomenon in the 1800s, and say, wait a minute. So all of these other peoples, all of these other states, they are all trying to wrestle with the idea of what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be Italian, French, whatever other group of people we want to talk about? And in the process of that, Jews are not fitting their new formulas very well? Well, the movements, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, in that order, basically took that discussion and agreed that they were part of European society, for better or worse, and then began to discuss how they would fit in to that community. Would they, in the 1800s, give in completely to the pull of equality by giving up the distinctiveness of being Jewish? Would they recoil from that opening of assimilation and become Orthodox? Would they try to strike a balance and become conservative? The Zionist movement essentially came along and said, actually, these Europeans, they have a point, which is we don't really belong here. We don't really fit in Europe, or anywhere for that matter, was an early Zionist position. Not necessarily one that you have to hold to be a Zionist in the modern world. Let me just get that out, an important caveat in the beginning. But the early Zionists were largely in agreement with those in Europe who said that Jews can never remain Jews and be full members of European society. Therefore, the solution would be self-determination. The same way different groups within Europe wanted to become self-determining. You wanted to have Serbians, and you wanted to have Czechs, and you wanted to have Slavs, and you wanted to have Bosnians, and the different groups wanted to have their own country, their own identity, their own style of nation. So too the Jews, say the Zionists, as well. This was their response to the crisis of the modern world, which, as we'll see, was more than just the questions of enlightenment. But I want to make sure you understand why we're doing this as a continuation of our discussion of the movements, because at its core, Zionism in the 1800s was a response to the same pressures, same questions, same issues that led to the creation of Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative Judaism. Obviously, Zionism had a very different result, as we will see. So, to understand Zionism, which talks about the restoration of the Jewish state and independence for the Jewish state, we have to first of all understand that there always were Jews in that territory. Again, I'm trying to be very specific here, going back to my political science days, that there wasn't a Jewish state, meaning an official government that was run by or for Jewish ideals, but there were Jews living in the land that would eventually become the modern borders of the state of Israel forever. Jews have remained attached and present in that territory for the last 3,000 years. As we say from Psalm 137, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in my memory, even at my happiest hour." Right? Jerusalem, as a symbol for all of Israel, has been part of our heart through everything that history has thrown at us, and no matter how far we've been spread. When we were sent to Babylon in 586, we longed to return. When we were under Roman occupation, we continued to stay and fight both militarily as well as in the courage of daily living against the Roman oppression to stay in our land. When there was persecution by the Muslims, by the Crusaders, by the different groups that would come and occupy, we continued to stay. Through famines, through droughts, through religious, ethnic persecution, through everything, and all the different empires you can imagine, Jews always continued to live in the land of Israel. Not the state, meaning they were not in charge of the country, they did not have autonomy or independence, but they always had a presence in the land. But we know that Jews ended up around the world. So how did that happen? If Jews were always in the land, how do we end up with Jews in large numbers in Europe, Jews in large numbers in the far Middle East, in places like modern-day Iraq and Iran? How do we end up with Jews in large numbers across North Africa? Well, the life for Jews who lived in the land of Israel during this time of foreign rulership wasn't great. For most of this time, we were subject to excessive taxation, meaning that Jews were taxed more heavily than the other people who lived in that place. There were often persecution and rules that would limit or punish outright our performance and observance of Jewish law. Many Jews were taken as slaves and carried off in large number. And many communities that were abroad, that were already established, simply were doing better. And some Jews chose to go to those communities in order to have an easier life for themselves and their children, and not fight the uphill battle that it was to live in the land of Israel during these intervening centuries. But I want to make sure that we understand that as much as we talk about the diaspora, the dispersal of the Jews around the world, there wasn't like one day when all the Jews got up and left only 100 people behind. There was no moment of mass exodus from the land of Israel. These were personal choices by individuals of whether to stay or go. These were personal tragedies of whether they were starved to death or whether they were murdered by attackers or whether they were taken as slaves. These were not wholesale national catastrophes, except for the few wars that were fought between us and the Romans. So over time, the population of Israel, of Jews in the land of Israel, did not have a huge drop except for those war moments. But by and large, what would happen was that there was no resurgence, no recovery of the population because life was so incredibly hard for the Jews living in the land of Israel. So you end up with a shifting balance. As Jews within the land are killed, starved, or leave piece by piece, and no large numbers come to replace them, you end up with the other communities, North Africa, Iraq, Iran, Europe, becoming larger and larger and larger in comparison. And the ratio of Jews who live inside the land of Israel and the Jews who live outside goes up, partly as the Jews inside goes down a little, but mostly as the number of those outside continues to go up exponentially. So those that still lived there became a smaller and smaller portion of our total nation, and unfortunately, due to the hardship they faced, often a less and less important part of our culture. So that the great scholars and the great leaders and the great merchants and the great scientists and the great artists became centered in the Iraq and Iran communities, the North African communities, the Spanish, the French, the German, the ones across the former Roman Empire. That was where you found the greatest minds and people of our ancestors for most of the last 2,000 years, and certainly from around the year 400 onward. It simply, you did not find, by and large, a strong Jewish presence in the land of Israel. Continuous, but not the leader of our people. There were a few bright spots, a few places where things looked like they might get better, but overall, the community in Israel simply lingered and continued on, but very much lacking any power and vitality for most of those years. That meant that the heart of Jewish living, the heart of Jewish thinking, the heart of Jewish leadership ended up in other communities. And the question then became, well, when will those other communities return? As we talked about last week in the discussion of what was expected of us to give up when we wanted to join European society, one of those was the longing to return to Israel. As I just mentioned, beginning with Psalm 137, we've always wanted to go back to Israel. When would we be able to? When would we be allowed to? The general view up until the 1800s, by and large, for the vast majority of the people, and certainly as a communal belief, was that there would be no large universal movement of the Jews back to the land of Israel until the time of messianic redemption, until Mashiach came, until the end of days, until the world was set right, Jews would simply go on living wherever they happened to be living and doing the best they could. And if an individual wanted to go back to the state, if an individual wanted to return, that was their choice, but we would not go back as a group. The psalm that's often chosen as an expression of this idea, that we stay where we are until God sends us the Messiah, is Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen keep vigil in vain. There was a general feeling to interpret this verse that God would make the first move and then we would follow. And if we as a group tried to make the first move, that we would only be doing so in vain, and we would bring down more problems on us, and it would be an unsuccessful endeavor. And we do know from history that the various false messiahs who tried to get people to move back to Israel under unscrupulous conditions, indeed, not only failed, but brought much suffering to themselves, their followers, and the Jewish people as a whole. Indeed, all the way up until the modern world, where you have Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, who was the former head of the Satmar Hasidim, Jewish sect. They said, even if the members of the Knesset, the modern Jewish parliament, were righteous and holy, it is terrible and awful criminal iniquity. It is a huge sin to seize redemption and rule before the time has come. So he, like most Orthodox until the middle of the 20th century, and some even after, refused to even entertain the idea of returning to Israel as a Jewish principle prior to the obvious and confirmed return of a Messiah. So for most of the last 2,000 years, people simply didn't go except as individuals. Indeed, drawing on the Talmud and Sanhedrin, there was a discussion about whether you're allowed to go back or not. Rav Yehuda said, anyone who ascends from Babylonia, which is where a large Jewish population lived at his time, to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, transgresses a positive mitzvah. As it is said, they shall be taken to Babylonia, and there they shall remain until the day that I recall them, said the Lord, Jeremiah 27. He's reading that to mean, you stay where you stay until God makes it clear. And Rabbi Zera, his opponent, he would interpret that verse from Jeremiah. That verse is written about the temple service vessels, and it does not refer to the Jewish people. As the previous verse states, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, concerning the vessels that remain in the house of the Lord. So he had the idea that it was possible for Jews to go back as a group. The argument continues. Why are there 3 oaths from Song of Songs? As you can see from chapter 2, verse 7, 3, verse 5, and 8, verse 4. Why are those 3 different statements needed? One, so that the Jews should not ascend Eretz Israel as a wall, meaning as a group. Individuals, yes, but not as a group. And another one, that the Holy One, blessed be He, adjured, made us swear that they should not rebel against the nations of the world, that we should be good visitors in their lands. And the last one is that the Holy One, blessed be He, adjured the nations, made the nations swear that they should not subjugate the Jews excessively. So we have to be good guests, they have to be good hosts. Obviously, that is not something that happens in many times in our history, and especially during the 1800s, and really, as we'll see later in the 1900s, becomes impossible to believe that we are being treated well by many of our European hosts. So, could we come back in large numbers? Well, there are a number of teachings that do seem to suggest that yes, we can. Right? A man, for example, in Jewish law, could compel his entire household to go up with him to the land of Israel, but may not compel one to leave. Meaning, if I were to suddenly say to my family, it's time to go to Israel, let's get on the plane, they would have to agree with me that going up to Israel is an act of such benefit and goodness that we could almost force each other to fulfill this opportunity. And vice versa, if you already are living in Israel and you want to leave, but your family wants to stay, you're not allowed to drag them out of the state. They are allowed to stay if they wish, even if it is against your wishes. And normally you would have such authority. But really, like I mentioned at the very, very beginning here, the main people that were thinking about returning to Israel were not doing so from a religious mentality. And people who were most interested in the religious issues of Judaism in their day were already convinced they were not allowed to go back in large numbers. The ones who want to go back, they wanted to go back to join in this pattern of self-determination. They wanted to be like the French, to be like the Slavs, to be like the Czechs, the Serbs, the Poles, all the others who are claiming the right to be in charge of their own life and their own territory. The Jews of Europe who joined in the Zionist movements believed that was true for Jews as well. Additionally, the anti-Semitism that was rising in Europe was becoming more and more painful. Of course, there had been anti-Semitism for 2,000 years. Of course, the anti-Semitism had often been exceedingly painful for our people, sometimes including the destruction of whole communities and definitely of families and smaller groups. But in the 1800s and then the early 1900s, we see destruction on a much, much larger scale, in many ways leading towards the eventual mass destruction of the Holocaust. But even before that, there were more expulsions, more murders, more harsh treatment across the European world. And that includes both Western Europe and Eastern Europe. One of the reasons why Jews were in much larger numbers in Eastern Europe, Poland and Russia, was because Western Europe had already persecuted and forced us to leave centuries before. Some remained, of course, but it was not a good situation and it was only getting worse. Okay, questions so far? I know I've done a lot just in the last 20 minutes, and I want to make sure I haven't lost everyone. And remember, if you're on YouTube, you're welcome to put something into the chat, and as soon as it catches my eye, I'll be happy to help clarify any points. All right, so let's talk then about the people who began this process. The different waves of immigration to the land of Israel are called aliyot. Aliyot means literally going up. It is the verb that is used for going to Israel because Israel is considered to be the spiritual high point of the world. It is the same verb used when you are called the Torah in the synagogue. So the different waves of immigration are broken into aliyot. So the first aliyah is marked by 1882 to 1903, the first 20-year period of organized efforts to move more and more people to the land of Israel. Again, not run by the Jews at this time. It is run by the Ottoman Empire, but groups are beginning to move there. And indeed, during this 20-year period, as many as 35,000 Jews are resettling in the land of Israel. Most of them are coming from Russia and Romania, places that were especially harsh for Jewish life at this time. Most of them were coming in response to deliberate attacks against Jewish communities. And the way this worked was that small groups would work together. They would buy land from the Turkish landowners. Like I mentioned, this was owned by the Ottoman Empire, which is part of Turkey, or Turkey was the head of the Ottoman Empire in this time. And that meant that many times the landowners did not live in the land itself. So somebody in Istanbul would be selling land in what we would call now the modern state of Israel, somewhere in the Galil, in the Galilee, somewhere what we would call Tel Aviv today, somewhere in Hebron in the south. They would sell the land to Jewish groups who would then move to the land and set up farms, set up small shops, try to live a normal life on the land that they had purchased. Now, if you were a local resident, what we would now call a Palestinian, although that title was not used in the national sense that it is today, it was purely geographical. But if you were somebody local and you saw these people arriving, this might cause some trouble, some annoyances. Practically, it might be that you had been renting the land that the Jewish people have now bought. So you were a tenant farmer. You would pay the guy in Istanbul for the land, renting it year after year. You would farm it and send him your rental fee based off what you farmed. Now, he sold the land to some Jewish group that wanted to pay him probably more than it was worth, and that Jewish group shows up and says, we want the land, we're going to be the farmers, goodbye. Well, if you are the tenant, you are more likely to be angry at the person who shows up on your doorstep than you are of the person in Istanbul who made the sale. And this begins to build resentment among many of the local people who were in that land at the time. Additionally, if you looked at the Jews who were arriving from Europe and you looked at their clothes and you listened to them speak, they sounded European. They looked European. They often ate European food. You knew local Jews, and the local Jews dressed like you and they ate like you. They kept kosher, of course, but they had similar food styles and similar clothing and similar language. But these Europeans are showing up. They are speaking Yiddish, which is a dialect of German mixed with Hebrew. They are dressing in European clothing. They are following European cultures and practices of how you interact with each other socially. This looks a lot like colonialism. If you are a Palestinian at the time, if you are somebody who lives there and you see these European Jews arriving, buying the land, setting up their life, and pushing you off, again, pushing, they purchase the land, but you feel like you've been pushed, chances are you've heard about this happening before. It's what the Europeans did in India. It's what the Europeans did in Australia. It's what the Europeans did in North America, South America. It's what the Europeans did in Vietnam and in Cambodia and China. Over and over and over again, the Europeans were taking over territory. And right at this time as well, Europeans were even accelerating their land grabs into Africa. So this just looks like regular colonialism. Europeans taking land from the people who live there. Now, it wasn't, because it, A, was not state-sponsored. It wasn't as though the country of Germany was sending Jews. It wasn't as though the country of Russia was sending Jews. B, the Jews were buying the land. They were not stealing it from anyone by pointing a rifle at them and saying, give me it. And C, they were not trying to deprive the locals of any of their rights or privileges or freedoms or protections under the law, nor were they trying to exploit them for the home country's benefit. They were true immigrants trying to move into the land, trying to develop it and themselves and have a better life in the land that had been their ancestral homeland. However, if you were a local at the time, there was a very real chance that you would not see it that way. And if you are beginning to hear the seeds of what will become the great problem of the 20th and 21st century between the Jews who have settled in the land of Israel and the non-Jews who are there in the land of Israel, then you are right on track. This is the origin of the Palestinian-Israeli issue that continues to this day. Please note, this origin is political and cultural, not religious. Right? The Jews who were settling had no problem with having Muslim neighbors. The Muslims who lived there had no problem with having Jewish neighbors. Yes, there were problems from time to time, but that just happened from any ethnic groups in this part of human history. But overall, they were not upset about different people from different faiths. Instead, the Palestinians misapplied the label of colonialism to the Jews that were coming. And that resentment has continued to this day primarily as a political antagonism, not a religious one. We'll talk about that in much more detail as we go on through this timeline. Now, around the same time, Zionism is formally getting started. The first Zionist Congress was held in 1897. It was conducted by a man named Theodor Herzl, who's often called the father of Israel, the modern state of Israel, or the George Washington of Israel. And Theodor Herzl was a great thinker, a great activist who moved Zionism from being a vague dream and hope into something that had practical, concrete action and steps that could be taken. And they had this huge assembly in 1897 where people from all over Europe got together to talk about this idea. And they established a number of different points. Zionism aimed, they said, at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. For the attainment of this purpose, the Congress considers the following means serviceable. Right? These are our ideas. Now, note at this time, people were hoping long-term that there could be an independent Jewish state, but in the short term, they were hoping at the very least to have a home, a place that Jews would be allowed to live in freedom and some form of equality that was different than the European experience at the time. Part 1, the promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. They wanted to get the community built. 2, the federation of all Jews into local or general groups according to the laws of the various countries. In order to make this a reality, they would need the support of Jews living in every part of the world. And you may notice that term federation. That is exactly why we call the umbrella group in most Jewish communities, at least in America, the Federation. It goes back to this time period when Jews were organizing themselves to work together for common purpose. 3, the strengthening of Jewish feeling and consciousness. This sees a revival of Hebrew as a spoken language, of Hebrew as a literature language. This sees new Jewish association groups, sees people working to promote the widespread celebration and enjoyment of Yiddish. Judaism as a feeling and consciousness, an identity, really gets accelerated at this time. And 4, preparatory steps for the attainment of those governmental grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose, which is basically saying, if we're ever going to have true freedom and permission to live there, and maybe even independence someday, we're going to need the governments of the world, at least a few, to support the idea. There's no way that we'll be able to create our own country by ourselves. We will need their permission. We are small, they are large. If we just go there and, start making a fence, we're not going to be able to hold on to that. We need their support. So this begins a very vigorous lobbying campaign where Jewish leaders will go to the leaders of other countries asking for support and permission for making the presence in Judaism, in Israel, a reality. The second Aliyah kicks off in 1904, going to 1914, obviously interrupted by the First World War. About 40,000 immigrants are going there mainly from Russia. And this is the next phase sped up by the continuing pogroms, the government organized and sanctioned attacks against Jews who lived in Russia. This was a huge problem in many parts of Eastern Europe, but in Russia it was especially bad. Now, 40,000 going to Israel from Russia may sound like a lot, but there are hundreds of thousands of Jews leaving Russia at this time, going to the United States, going to Latin America, and some making it as far as South Africa. This is a time of many, many Jews leaving Russia and Europe altogether. But as you can see, a small portion of them have decided that the best place to be would be in a Jewish place, in Israel. This is because they are saying, look, the French kicked us out, the Germans kicked us out, the Poles kicked us out, the Russians are killing us and murdering us. Why do we want to go to another country, even if the country seems friendly today, and know that in another 10 years, 50, 100, they're going to turn on us? Remembering that Poland and Russia, for example, invited the Jews in. They welcomed the Jews and gave them incentive to move in order to try and help their own economy grow by bringing in Jewish people who were established with many trades. And then they turned against them. So if you move to the US, to Canada, to Argentina, Brazil, it may seem friendly today, but in 50 years, they may be doing the same thing. But if we go to our own country, these people say, then maybe we'll be able to prevent that from happening. So this is a large push. It's during this time that Tel Aviv is established. It's also during this time that Hebrew is formally revived as a spoken language. Although it had always been part of our culture, our prayers and our study as a daily conversational language, Hebrew had not been used for, depending upon the community, hundreds or thousands of years. It simply wasn't the language of day-to-day speech. but it was kicked off again by Eliezer ben Yehuda and created as a modern language, and many vocabulary words were added in order to make the language capable of dealing with many modern vocabulary. And really, the revitalization of Hebrew as a language is one of the miracles of the reestablishment of the State of Israel, and really one of the miracles of linguistics. There are no other examples that I have been brought to my attention of any languages that had ceased to be spoken as a regular language that have been revived into a widely used, widely known, fully functioning, and primary language of a nation. It is something that is unprecedented. During this time as well, we see the Kibbutz movement really start to take off. As I mentioned in the last Aliyah, we saw people coming as groups, that people were working together, that there was a sense of collaboration. Well, in addition to Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative Judaism and Zionism, there was also an overarching theme in many Jewish communities of socialism. Not socialism in the modern distorted conversations, and certainly not socialism in the modern misinformation that's used about that term. Socialism in the classic idea that you should have a community where people voluntarily lived and worked together, shared the ownership of the goods of that community, and would share the responsibility of making things happen. So you would have a kibbutz settlement where some people would work in the farm, some people would work in the kitchen, some people would work on small factories, and everybody worked together, everybody shared the benefit of the group's labor, people would eat together in communal halls. There was a lot of shared life. And the kibbutz movement continues in Israel, not as strong as it once was, but this idea of shared living and shared land for different voluntary groups was a very powerful catalyst for the early Zionist success, because it gave people these ready-built communities that were passionately devoted to each other and the improvement of themselves and the land that they lived on. Now, like I mentioned, World War I comes along, and this makes things much worse and a little better. If you put yourself back and remember, the whole idea of World War I was the Axis and Allies, was the Germans against the French and the British and the Russians, but there was also the Ottoman Empire. It's often forgotten in many Western histories, but the Ottoman Empire was on the same side as Germany. And that meant that England, in particular in this case, was also fighting the Ottoman Empire. And remember, the Ottoman Empire controlled the area that we call Palestine at this time. So the Jewish people went to the British people and said, hey, you know, we'd love to help you with this whole World War I thing. Wouldn't it be nice if you get control of this part of the world, the area of Palestine? Wouldn't it be nice if you could help us set up a Jewish homeland there? Remember, going back to the Zionist Congress, they wanted the support of the different powers of the world. And at this time, there really was no power comparable to England. England was near the peak of its power, beginning to wane as World War I took its toll. But this was sort of the best case scenario of getting a patron, somebody to help make this happen. And indeed, the Jewish leaders in England were able to convince the government of England to issue what's called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which reads as follows. It is short but incredibly important for history. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This innocent little sentence is incredibly important. Basically, it is saying the British government will work to try and help there be a Jewish homeland in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel. And it understands that when such a homeland is established, those who are not Jewish will still be given their rights and freedoms, And those who are Jewish and choose to live outside of the land of Israel, meaning regular British subjects and citizens, will also continue to be given their support, the support of England. This is a very important point. There were many people who allied themselves with Zionism that were anti-Semitic. There were people who thought, you know what, get all the Jews back to Israel, whatever, shove them off into that corner of the Mediterranean. It's not important to us anyway. And once there's a state, we will take everybody in England and France and Germany, and we will force them to go live there. And the Balfour Declaration was designed to say, that's not the plan. If there is a homeland for the Jews in the state of Israel, that doesn't mean that other Jews will be forced to go there or have their rights taken away in any other country. That was a very important part of this declaration. So at this time, when the French and the British took over the Ottoman Empire, they began to divide up the different pieces of territory. This is the map of what's called the British Mandate. That means the territory the British were in control of. And this was what was divided up in what's called famously the Sykes-Picot Treaty, when the British and the French worked together to decide who would get which piece of the Ottoman Empire. And if that sounds like colonialism, yes, yes it is. When the British took over, and the French as well in the other areas, it absolutely was a version of colonialism. They were taking over the territory with an aim that they would eventually be able to reap a profit from their control of this piece of the earth, the same way they had in India and other parts of the world. As you can imagine, this makes some people a little upset. And when they draw the lines for the Mandate of Palestine, you can see here on the large border that it was a huge area covering most of what is now modern day Israel and going outward into what is now modern day Jordan. At that time, that territory was called Transjordan. Everyone with me so far on the map? Okay, things are going to speed up on what's happening here. I hope you've all got a good understanding of the interests and the different issues, because now we move into the post-World War I era, 1919 to 1923. Again, the British Mandate starts making life both easier and more difficult. Now there is a formal patron supporting this. The Jews are no longer having to deal with an Ottoman Empire government, which was rife with corruption and obstacles. 40,000 immigrants are moving from Europe to Israel. The swamps are drained, agriculture is being expanded, and Jewish groups are beginning to organize to provide for common defense, militias. The most famous at this time was called the Haganah. This would eventually become the nucleus of the Israeli army in 1948. So you see a lot more growth and a lot more prospects, but you also begin to see more friction with the locals. Since Britain has now made this very formally a colonial possession, you can imagine that the people who were already suspicious of Jews as colonists are going to be even more upset during this time period. Additionally, England decides that they need to create another state, what's going to be called the Emirate of Transjordan, or in the modern world, Jordan, and they're going to carve that out of the eastern bank of the Jordan River territory and give it to one of their allies during the First World War. So this was an attempt to create a state that would be friendly and subservient to England in that territory. So that territory is removed from the Mandate of Palestine, given to the Transjordan, newly invented state, and what is left to be called Palestine is now only on the western side of the Jordan River. That, of course, is going to make it much harder when it comes time to divide later. The fourth Aliyah continues from 1924 to 1929, another upsurge of immigration, 82,000 people from Poland, from Romania. People are beginning to start leaving Europe in more desperation. Much more is being developed. And then, of course, Fifth Aliyah, 1929 to 1939. 250,000 new immigrants. Why are people fleeing in such large numbers, and why are they ending up in Israel? Well, they're fleeing in large numbers because Germany is going crazy, right? During this time of the rise of Nazism and the rise of Hitler, it wasn't as though you had to wait for Hitler to happen. It is already begun to have more anti-Semitism and more antagonism. People are already desperate to get out of Europe. At the same time, however, most of the other Western nations have begun to greatly scale back or completely ban immigration. So during this time period, the United States, for example, is closing its doors to Jewish immigrants, as well as immigrants from China, Japan, and many other parts of the world. This is a very dark part of American history, a very racist part of American history, and one which leads unnecessarily to the death of millions of Jews who are trapped in parts of Europe and cannot find countries to go to that will accept them. However, at this time, many of them are moving into Israel, at least until England also begins to crack down on Jewish immigration into the territory. So at least 250,000 people from Europe are able to get into Israel, one of the only places that will accept them at that time, on and off, and much of that being illegal immigration against the British wishes. Many of these people are coming with advanced skills. They are not coming just to be farmers, but are bringing engineering, sciences, medicine, law, and many other high-end skills to the Jewish community there. So by 1940, as World War II is beginning, there are at least 450,000 Jews now living in the area that is marked on that map of, there we are, as the Mandate of Palestine under British control. Everyone still with me? I know this is a lot of information that I'm dumping. During this time period, then, we also see the Arabs begin to push back. They begin to riot, often based off false information, lies, and slander, much of it against the Jews, unfortunately. And there is, in particular, a mass riot that begins in Hebron, but then spreads to other parts of the country, where many Jews are taken and killed. It is very similar to what they faced in Eastern Europe and Russia. So obviously the Jews are very upset about this, and obviously the Jews push back. Now, unlike in Eastern Europe and Russia, the Jews have their own militias, the Jews have their own weapons, and the Jews are fighting back. And there is more equality given the numbers of people on each side. During this same time period, from 1936 to 1939, the Arab population of Palestine attempts to have a revolution against the British control. And as they have their attacks, England crushes it brutally. Really in the American Revolution, we got off almost easily. The British were ruthless colonialists in most other parts of the world. And in particular here, during this time period, they are ruthless in their subjugation of the Arab Revolt. Again, not that I would wish that the Arab Revolt had succeeded. If it had, it would have been terrible for the Jewish population, both in Israel and elsewhere. But the British were brutal in their crackdown. And in their brutality, they essentially break the Arab community for that generation. They leave it without solid leadership. They lead it without a clear mission. And they leave it mostly in the hands of the religious leaders, since the political and civil leaders of the Arab communities have mostly been imprisoned or murdered during this time period. That's going to be very important when it comes time for the final partition in 1948. So in 1937, right before World War II, England is already thinking that they would like to get rid of this territory because it seems like it's more trouble than it's worth. After all, there is no great oil fields, there's no great precious metals. Why would they want to control this population which doesn't like them? So England is already thinking of getting out. And in order to agree with the Balfour Declaration supporting the Jewish homeland, they initially decide that they would give this territory to the Jewish population and give the remaining territory to the Arab state. Now, this, called the Peel Partition, never comes to pass. It never is formally introduced as an option because World War II happens. And that kind of thing really changes everybody else's plans. No one is interested in the independence movement. Now they are interested just in fighting against the Nazi power and making sure that they do not win. So this gets shelved. Additionally, between that time period, between World War I and World War II, right, the British are really upset with keeping control of this. They think that if they limit the number of Jews who immigrate from Europe, that this will make the local Arab population happy. It turns out it doesn't. They still are attacking Jewish communities as well as the British colonialists. And during this time, as I mentioned, the US and other nations have already enacted laws that make it very hard for Jews to go to those countries too. So the Jews fight back. They fight back against the British. They fight back against the Arabs. They smuggle people in. And some Jewish groups do commit what can only be called acts of terrorism, whether it be the bombing of hotels, whether it be the assassination of leaders. There are some Jewish groups who have decided that the only way that there will ever be an independent and safe Jewish state is to commit what we would call atrocities in any other circumstance. And it is still very controversial whether or not these groups and what they did should be condemned or not. That is a much longer conversation that we are not going to have now. But do understand that there were Jewish groups who did things that were not good. Not the majority. It wasn't the most effective tactic. It wasn't essential, I think most people would argue. Certainly fighting back and having some resistance was, but some of the brutality, most would argue, was not. However, it is still debated exactly how that should be viewed as part of the history of the establishment of Israel as a separate state. World War II comes. Obviously, the Jews are trapped. Obviously, the Jews are being murdered in Europe. And obviously, it would have been better if there had been an Israel before World War II. If there had been a Jewish state, if there had been a state run by Jews and with protections for Jews that couldn't close the doors, that wouldn't close the doors, then all of the millions of Jews who were trying to leave Europe before the rise of the Nazi party to its complete apex of power would have been able to leave. They would have been able to flee. So this underscores the need for a Jewish homeland that will never turn its back on the Jews of the world. This reinvigorates more people for the need for Israel, not just for the people who live there, but for the Jews around the world who might need it as their refuge if there is trouble. Right? Millions died that didn't have to die because there was no place for them that they could go. There was no place that would allow them to go. After World War II, the United Kingdom, England, is still refusing to accept most of the refugees. There are millions of displaced people right after the war. Most of them, or many of them at least, are Jews. They are looking for a place to go. Many of them hope to go to Israel. Many others do end up in America and other parts of the West. But England is still unwilling to let many in because they do not want to cause more trouble with the local Arab population. However, continued anti-Semitism in Europe and the rise of communism, which is oppressing Jews as well as everyone else in Europe, is making more Jews who have already been displaced not eager to go back to their homes. What's the point of going back to Poland now that you've survived the concentration camps just to be put into a gulag by the communist leadership? What's the point of going back if you're going to be attacked by your neighbors for being Jewish? Does it make a difference whether they're wearing a swastika or whether they're just attacking you in good old-fashioned anti-Semitism? More and more the Jews are saying there is no more home for us, at least in Eastern Europe. And so during this time, approximately another 100,000 Jews immigrate either during the war or right after the war to the state of Israel. Which leads, and this is a huge jump because we don't have time to go into all the details, which leads to the United Nations. Formed during World War II, the United Nations was an attempt to put together a global organization that would allow for the discussion and agreed upon solving of international problems. One of the things that comes up, of course, is what to do about the Palestinian Mandate, the British-controlled area of territory along the strip of the Eastern Mediterranean. How should it be handled? Everybody has for decades known that the Jews would like to have their own state there. Everyone has known that for decades, many of the people who live there don't want that to happen. Who should be allowed to make that decision? Well, in 1947, November 29th, the United Nations finally makes a vote to agree that there should be a partition, that the land of Israel should be divided, the British Mandate of Palestine should be divided, and part of it should be given to a Jewish state, and the other part should be given to the Arab or Palestinian state. As you can see, this resolution 181 was voted up in favor by 33, it was voted down by 13, and 10 of the states chose not to vote at all, and one wasn't even there for the vote. But this majority gave the permission for there to be a Jewish state. Again, going back to our first Zionist Congress, now you have a vote by a world organization that indeed there should be a Jewish state. The Jews wanted more. We already felt that the mandate had been reduced. We already felt that we were being given inadequate territory. We already felt that the area on the east side of the Jordan should have been part of the discussion. All of that had already been removed from the table, but we were willing to agree by the UN resolution to take the land that they were offering and to accept that there would also be a parallel state run by the non-Jewish group that was the majority in that area, and that there would be two separate states. However, the non-Jewish population did not agree. As I mentioned before, they were certainly lacking in leadership thanks to the British crackdown during the 30s. They also did not have much helpful guidance from the surrounding nations, all of whom were hoping to take advantage of the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the removal of the British to take the land for themselves. So, unfortunately, the communities in the territory were told, do not agree to this partition. We will set you free and we will get rid of the Jews. And this is setting up the first war in Israel. This is what the partition looked like. As you can see, these areas were given as territory that was set aside for the Jews. And these areas where hopefully you can see my mouse, were given as territory set aside for the Arab population. And Jerusalem was intended to be an international city, a separate state all to itself under United Nations administration. If this map looks a little weird, yes, everybody thought it looked weird. It was roughly based upon the population majorities in different areas in order to try and track what was a majority Jewish or a majority non-Jewish in different zones. So you can see the area around the Sea of Galilee or Lake Tiberias is 67% Jew, 67% Arab, 33% Jewish. That's just a second. And that is why it has a large Jewish population. It is being put together with the area around Haifa. And then, although you have a large Muslim population here, because of the huge population of Jews in the area of Jaffa, which is modern-day Tel Aviv, that gets balanced out. They're trying to stitch it together to give some areas with a Jewish percentage a more contiguous, touching territories that they can then have. Perhaps numbers will say it louder than the graphic. In the ultimate partition, the Arab state had a population of 725,000, 99% of whom were Arabs. And 10,000 were Jewish population. In the Jewish territories in the partition, there were 407,000 Arabs that were living there, and there were 498,000 Jews that were living there, giving it a total population of 90,000. As you can see, it is a much more equal distribution of population. And then in the international section, meaning the territory around Jerusalem. There was 100,000 Arabs, 100,000 Jews. It was almost completely equal population. I'm going to actually, in the interest of time, skip the Declaration of Independence, but please look up the Jewish Declaration of Independence. It is a very beautiful document about the aspirations of our people, not just for a return to Israel, but to establish a country that is built on equality and freedoms and rights. It is a very, very moving document, and one that should be looked at over and over again to remind ourselves of our highest principles. But we're also going to talk about the status quo another time, but we need to talk about the War of 1948. So, as I mentioned, the local population as well as the surrounding Arab population do not agree with the partition as laid out by the United Nations. And so Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, so-called Arab Liberation Army, and other volunteers all attack Israel on the day after Israel declares its independence in 1948. And Israel wins. Now, if you have that kind of army coming against you, and you have only Israel against it, Israel was alone in its fight for its independence, how did Israel win? Well, the Arabs were disunited. They did not have a single command structure, and they were not working together very well. They also underestimated the Israelis. They thought that the Jews who lived there would be easy to kill, and that there would not be any strong resistance. Additionally, the Israelis were fighting for survival. The Arab armies have made it clear that they were not merely going to take the territory, but that they were going to murder the Jews who lived there, that it would be another Holocaust. So clearly, if you are an Israeli, you're not fighting just for political control, you are fighting for survival. Additionally, since the Israelis are fighting from a central location, they were able to move and redistribute their forces to meet the different attacks by different Arab armies, which were not coordinated, in order to have a majority in many of the battles they fought. Additionally, Israel mobilized its whole population, whereas the Arab armies were not fighting with their full forces, but with a token force in some cases, just to be participating in the battle. And Israel is considered to have had much better equipment and much better training in order to fight more efficiently, remembering, of course, that many people had been learning much about this during the previous years of World War II, about how to fight effectively. But it is important, in my opinion, to remember that the disunity of the Arabs was a major contributing factor. Not only did they lack a command structure, but they also lacked a common goal. Most of the Arab armies were hoping to win territory for their own countries. There were none that were interested in giving freedom to the population that lived there. Egypt was not going to create a Palestinian state. Transjordan was not going to create a Palestinian state. Syria was not going to create a Palestinian state. Each was hoping to absorb any of the territory it could capture. And therefore, none of them wanted the other Arab armies to be too successful, because that would put them at a disadvantage. So if you remember, this was our partition in 1947 that was established by the United Nations. By the time the war is brought to a halt by a ceasefire, by an armistice, the territory that Israel occupies looks like this, and the territory that is occupied by the Arab armies looks like this. And Egypt occupies Gaza. It becomes under Egyptian control. They do not create an independent state there. And the West Bank, as it is often called, is occupied by the Jordanian armies. It also does not become an independent state. Instead, both of these territories are then taken over by Arabs. And so there is never the establishment of what would be called a Palestinian state until this day. It is incredibly sad and heartbreaking that in 1948, there could have been two states for two different nations, and we could have had coexistence for this entire time period. Unfortunately, the enemies did not want that to happen. And unfortunately, we have still not been able to find a formula that will bring a lasting peace. But we'll talk about that in much more detail in our next class. But I need to remind you, if you weren't here at the beginning, Next week is the beginning, what is it called? New Year's Eve. I almost said Erev New Year's. New Year's Eve. And as such, we will not be having class next Thursday, but instead I will see you next year for our next class, where we'll continue the story of Israel up till the modern time. Take care, everyone, and have a great New Year.